The first thing I want to do is take a look at some different kinds of knives. So these are some different knives from my kitchen. And you'll see that one of the first things you'll notice is the edges are a little bit different. So sometimes we can interchange knives, and sometimes it's best to use the knife that is called for. So the main thing that's different here is that the knives on this side have a serrated edge. So that's this bumpy edge with little pokey things coming out, and those are really good for getting through tough surfaces. So the two on the left here are steak knives, and of course meat is going to be a little bit tougher to slice through than, say, butter. The middle one here is a filleting knife, and we're actually going to use that to cut into a tomato. So while the inside of the tomato is very soft, the outside's a little bit tougher, and if we push really hard with one of our other knives, then we can end up squashing the tomato before we can get through the skin of the tomato. These other knives are often called paring knives, and they might be used to cut fruits or vegetables that are more easily sliced through. When cutting with a knife, it's important that you hold it properly so you don't end up injuring yourself. So, of course, you want to keep your hands on the handle and not in front of the blade. Now, what's very common is for people to put their pointer finger of their dominant hand as sort of a guide. And, I'll admit I do that sometimes too. What's the preferred way is to use your thumb and forefinger to grip just the edge of the blade. And it feels very weird at first, but if you do a lot of chopping and cooking, this can be a better way to control the knife than just with your finger. The second thing that you want to pay attention to is what's happening with your other hand, because your other hand is probably holding your fruit or vegetable. So what I want to do is hold the fruit or vegetable that I'm working with my finger in kind of a C shape. And so I've got my fingers pointed down at the fruit or vegetable so that as I'm slicing, those fingers are not going to get in the way. So I'm going to hold it like this, and it feels a little awkward at first again, but that's going to help keep your fingers safe. Now, the first cut that you make into a fruit or vegetable, because most of them are going to be round, is to give yourself a flat surface. So an apple has a nice thing that it can rest on, but if you're looking at a potato or something else, it's going to roll around. And so what you want to do, you can cut it in half, or you can just kind of cut off a smaller edge. And again, you're going to hold this, let me tilt my hand, so that your fingers stay behind the blade. You can grip the blade with your thumb and forefinger and cut through. And now you have a nice flat surface on which to put your fruit or vegetable so that you can cut it without it rolling around for you. The next thing we're going to look at is the size of pieces that we might be cutting our food into. So I'm just going to continue working with this apple. So the size is going to depend on the thickness of our cut. So I've got here about a 1/2 inch cut on this one, and that's the one I'm going to work with first. These pieces are about a 1/4 inch thick, and then I've got some that are closer to an 1/8 inch thick. So when we're dicing something, we want all of the thicknesses, we're going to try and make cubes, and we want all of those thicknesses to be about 1/2 inch thick. So if you want it to be perfect, you can pull out your ruler and kind of measure it, or you can just kind of eyeball it. It's about the width of your thumb. And so I've got one edge that's 1/2 inch thick, but now I've got to cut it 1/2 inch thick in the other directions. Again, I'm going to make my hand into a C so that I don't hurt myself. And so now I have a piece that is about 1/2 inch thick all the way around, and this would be more like a baton. Sometimes you'll hear the term batonette. But in order to make diced apples, I would then further cut this into 1/2 inch pieces. And you can see they're not perfectly squared, but they're basically squared pieces. So you may have heard the term Julienne as a way of cutting foods, or as a person's name, but we're talking about cutting foods here. And so for Julienne, we want about 1/8 of an inch thick, and this is about 1/4 of an inch thick, so it's a little bit wider than we want, but it's really kind of hard to get that same thickness throughout. So you can see this was about 1/8 inch on this side, but it's much thicker on this side. So it might be helpful to cut it into 1/4 inch slices and then to cut those in half. So I'm going to make 1/4 inch slices on these first and then cut them in half. So we can see that these are much wider on one side than they are on the other, and now I can take each of these in turn and cut them lengthwise so that I have more of that Julienne type slicing. Now if I leave them like this, as I mentioned before, this is called a batonette. So it's kind of like a French fry, you can think of that. But if you're ever looking at a recipe that says Julienne, we can make these sort of French fry-like sticks first. I think I got a piece of the core there. And then go back and cut these into our smaller pieces. So those are the two basic ones that you would use, the dicing and the Julienne. Sometimes you'll see a fine Julienne, in which case you want to make these into teeny, teeny, tiny pieces, about 1/16 of an inch. And then there's some other variations in between that if you really get into cooking, you can pay attention to. But what we're going to do for our salsa lab is we're going to think about how the size that we cut the food into affects our experience of that food. And so we'll have different groups cut the ingredients into different sizes and see what we think of the salsa that we make.